So today is September 25th, 2020. My name is Chelsea Lee, and I'm here with Mr. Salhotra, and we will be conducting a full-length interview. Let's get started. I will be dividing up the interview into several sections.
Okay.
The first one we're starting off with is kind of early life. So where and when were you born? Can you describe the household and neighborhood you grew up in?
Yes. So I was born in California, near San Francisco, in 1990. And I don't really remember too much about that because we moved to Houston when I was one. Um, so when we moved to Houston, we initially lived in an apartment on Westheimer, um, 7979 Westheimer, actually. And that was, we lived there for only a few years, and then moved to Bel Air, where we have lived, ever since, my family. I lived there through high school, then went to Rice, and then did go away for 3 years of law school, but then came back to Houston. I would say that it was a very supportive community. There were not a lot of South Asians initially in Bel Air as they are today. Now there's several thousand or a few thousand, I should say. But yeah, at that time there, I think were a little less. But yeah, I mean, ultimately it was a very, 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 very fortunate upbringing, I should say.
Yeah. Okay, we're gonna go a bit into the background of your parents. So, what were your parents' occupations, and what were some of the values that they emphasize in your upbringing?
Yeah, so my dad came here from India for graduate school. He was engineer by training in India and came here for graduate school, and is and was, of course, when I was growing up, still is an environmental engineer. Um, and my mom came here when she was about 12 with my grandparents. So she did kind of the rest of uh, middle school, junior high, and then high school, of course, and college here. And she was and is a professor at the University of Houston downtown campus. And so, education was a very critical and key value that was emphasized, both from my mom, her experience as a professor, and then my dad was a consultant, but did do a lot of sort of trainings for different people in the field. And so teaching and education was certainly something that that was important to him. So education is a critical value. I would say the second one is family. Every winter we would spend time with family. In the summer we'd spend time with family. So that became a very core part of our value system. And then we are Hindu, and so we did go to temple. And ironically, I think actually, I wouldn't say that. I will say that initially we were kind of forced to go to temple and Sunday school, and so on. But I think as I got older, and even now, it's sort of become more of a personal choice. And so while I don't think like religion per se was a value, I think spirituality certainly was one. And then I would say, maybe the last one was, particularly from my mom, this spirit of service. So, she chose to teach, at UH downtown, of course, which is largely which is a university largely composed of first generation and or students of color and or lower income students. And so she always had that, has that sort of focus on service. I think that has certainly, become something I care a lot about.
Yeah, for sure. So speaking more about education, I saw that you attended Rice. Can you speak a little bit about your experiences, any challenges you faced, or anything you learned in particular that stood out?
Yeah. So, as I said, so I grew up here, went to high school and then applied to college and ultimately decided on Rice in part because I think I was not ready to leave Houston. I was really liked Houston. I loved being close to home, and so Rice just felt like the right fit. And so spent time obviously at Rice. It was a great experience on a couple different levels. I think one is I really kind of developed my passion. So, coming into Rice, I was not so focused on public service and politics and education as I am now. And I think that sort of passion came from my time at Rice. So whether it was some of the classes I took, sociology department, for example, with Professor Turley, or some of the experiences I had, whether researching at the Baker Institute at Rice, or taking a semester off to intern in DC, um, or of course some of the friends I made who had done Teach for America before me, and sort of inspired me to go into, or to even learn about it. Did not know about it before coming to Rice. So I'd say in that regard, I learned a lot about myself. I think in terms of the challenges, I would say that I think one thing that I struggled with at Rice, I was very lucky. I did not. I felt that I had been prepared academically for Rice, coming from St. John's for high school. So I felt very lucky in that regard. Um, I also was lucky that I had some AP credits, and so I was able to kind of place out of some of the distribution requirements, so I could really focus on classes that I was very interested in. Um, However, I will say that one of the things that I struggled with at Rice is I sort of, um, I guess, initially focused on trying to get to know as many people as I could, and I didn't have as many close and deep connections as I would have liked. And that's something that changed kind of towards the end of college, and then certainly in like my future experiences, I really prioritized sort of making deeper connections with fewer people, of course. So, yeah.
You mentioned Professor Turley, and I had her last semester, so that's super
Mm.
interesting. But what subjects were you interested in studying, and what did you end up majoring in?
Came into Rice wanting to do business. And that was because I'd taken economics class in high school and really enjoyed it. And so I thought business was kind of the um, next step. Um, and so I, obviously added the economics major, and then I had wanted to do the business minor as well. Um, and sort of began that path. I took kind of one of the initial courses for the business minor, and I really loved economics. But then as I said, took a semester off from Rice the fall of my sophomore year to intern with Obama at the White House when he was President Obama. And so that experience really pushed me more into the public service, bucket, if you will. And so that led me to sort of move away from from sort of disregard the business minor, and I added the policy studies major, which I think now is maybe the social policy analysis type major. But I ended up graduating with economics, which I always was interested in, and then social policy analysis, or I guess policy studies, which came from, I think, my experience kind of thinking and working in policy.
Yeah, I guess thinking back to that time in college, were there some like defining moments that you would say really stood out to you?
Yeah. So I would say so my freshman year in the fall, um, it's like week 2 of school, I ended up getting swine flu, which is at that point was like a big thing. And so I ended up missing some classes. And I remember one of my classes, I don't remember the professor's name, and you'll probably see why in a second. I had a homework assignment and I couldn't do it. It was a political science statistics class, and I couldn't do it because I was sick. And so I emailed her. It was like week 2 of school, and I said, hey, wasn't able to do it. Um, and she said, uh, no problem. I'll give you a 0 on this, and you can make it up in future assignments because it's only one small homework assignment. And that's when I was super into the grades, and every single assignment had to be super.
Yeah.
So I ended up dropping out of that class, so in the add drop period, and I randomly added a leadership 101 or something, introduction to leadership. And that class is, I built a great relationship with the professor, no longer there now at MIT, but that's the class where I learned about the White House internship. So it was really a seminal class for me. And it wouldn't have happened if I sort of, so that was one really pivotal moment for me. I would say a second is, when I applied for the internship the first time, I got rejected. And so that was tough. But it was sort of led me to kind of reapply for a second time, where, I succeeded, through a lot of help from friends. I think then in my senior year, I was sort of deciding kind of what to do after Rice. And, initially I'd been very interested in applying to fellowships abroad, Rhodes, Marshall, et cetera. And I applied to 5 different ones, I think my senior year, maybe 4, and got rejected from all of them. And that's, I think, what helped me find really what I was passionate about. Led me to Teach for America, which I was interested in, but thought, hey, let me go to the fellowship and then I'll come back and do TFA. But that was life-changing, pivotal moment. And then I think the last one would be, I was deciding at the end between a consulting offer and Teach for America. And I remember meeting one of my really good friends. We were just talking, and we had a long talk at his house about kind of like, hey, what do you want to do? Like, what makes more sense? And I think that sort of really pushed me to pick TFA, which has been a life-changing experience for me.
I was going to move on to the law school topic, but I guess you also mentioned TFA.
Yep.
So, did law school come before that or after? Can you explain a little bit more about what happened?
Yeah. So graduated from Rice in 2013. Did TFA for 2 years, 2013 to 2015, and then went to law school 2015 to 2018.
Um, yeah, so I guess what motivated you to pursue law school after TFA?
So I started teaching fall 2013, and I loved it. And I loved those 2 years deeply, every day getting to work with students and getting to, have an opportunity to try to help them, and I was teaching high school math, so really help them, kind of get ready for college, quite frankly. But I think what I saw was 2 things. One is, um, there were many other issues outside of education that were affecting students, whether it was housing or living in a food desert without access to clean food, or not clean food, but healthy food, um, um, whether it was immigration, whether it was flooding, etc. And so I think that was one. I think the second thing I realized was, you know, being a teacher is great, but it is more kind of day to day, and it's more micro level. And while I loved it, there were these big macro challenges. Just in Houston ISD alone, there's 200,000 plus kids. And so, while being a teacher is great, having that impact is critical, scale is such a big part of this, and sort of making sure we can get to that level. And so I think what I kind of have spent time kind of thinking about, and what kind of pushed me to uh, law school, is that desire to sort of learn about and impact areas beyond education, and B, to move from the micro kind of day-to-day impact to more of a macro policy level impact.
Yeah, so I've heard about like 1L in law school and stuff like that. How difficult was your experience?
You know, I would say 2 things. I would say one is being a teacher. First year of being a teacher was harder than the first year of being a lawyer. Being in law school, because law school was academically tough, but emotionally and physically it wasn't as much. Um, and so I will say that a lot of people, um, I will say that a lot of people um, are very competitive in law school, and so it makes it harder because they put themselves in some ways in somewhat of okay, I got to get the top grade so I can make it to the law review, so I can get this clerkship, so I can blah blah blah, or I got to get the top grade so I can go to this law firm and do this, you know. Whereas for me, I was very clear that, hey, like I'm here to learn, and I'm here to I'm going to come back to Houston in the long run. I don't really want to do a clerkship. It doesn't matter to me to be on the law review. I'm much more focused on the political, on the public service, on the education. I was kind of working on some nonprofits on the side. And so I think, and then I found a small group of friends, some still my best friends, who also had kind of that same mindset. And so it never really was that hard or competitive, in part because I think we as a group kind of didn't, focus on that.
Okay, a follow-up question to that then. What did you enjoy most or dislike most about your experience?
In law school,
Yes.
what did I dislike the most? You know what I liked? I'll start there because those are on
Okay.
top of my head, and I'll sort of think about the dislike one. On the like side, one is I'm at a place where everybody is focused on like politics and public policy and talking about that like all the time, whereas at Rice that is not necessarily the case. So that was one thing I really liked. The second thing, as I mentioned, was this sort of small close group of friends um, that was amazing, and talk to those guys every day still, and so that was great. I think I loved, one of the cool parts about law school is you start to learn some stuff, and then you can join these clinics where you actually apply what you learn to representing real people. And so I would represent folks who are getting evicted from their home, for example. And so that experience was super powerful. Um, and then, I'll be honest, I think part of what I liked was I was not in Houston. I mean, I sort of got to leave Houston for a little bit, spend some time in a different city. You always learn new things, meet new people. There were people from literally everywhere in Boston. Um, I think I disliked probably some of that competitiveness that I saw from some of my peers. And then I think sometimes law school becomes very theoretical, which I didn't necessarily love.
Yeah. All right. Final question for law school. Why did you end up choosing Harvard Law School, and what was kind of like the process of getting there, as well as like were there any distinct mentors that you remember?
Yeah. So why did I, what was the process to get there? Law school is unfortunately just like two things, LSAT and GPA. And so, GPA is what it is from college. And so the LSAT, I took it twice. First time I didn't do as well as I had wanted to. Um, I picked Harvard because, at the end of the day, I wanted to be in a big city because I wanted to sort of have that piece of the experience as well. Number two is I knew I wanted to take classes on policy, and so I wanted a policy school there. Three, my sort of three biggest political role models are Barack Obama, Joaquin Castro, and Julian Castro, and I was like, they all went to Harvard. Maybe that's coincidental. I don't know. So I think that was, in all honesty, probably part of it. So that was sort of how I picked it. In terms of mentors, yeah. So I would say that there were a couple. So one is what is a guy named Charles Ogletree. So he was President Obama's professor when he was there, and we became close. And he kind of helped me learn about opportunities even back in Houston because he was friends with the mayor, and so that really helped me. Got connected to Mayor Turner here in Houston. So he was one. A second one was a professor named Mark Wu, who I really got to know very well. He was, I think, one of the first. He became one of the first male tenured professors, Asian professors in like Harvard's history, maybe. Pretty recent. He's just a great guy who sort of combined sort of the theory with the like bigger picture. I had another professor, Tomiko Brown Nagin, who was education law professor, and so I spent a lot of time with her. Um, and then I would say the last one is a guy named Sabil Rahman, who I think it was the first time I had ever had a South Asian male professor. Um, and so to see someone who, kind of looked like me and had similar passions, that was great.
Okay, so kind of moving on into your early career, I see that
Yep.
you transitioned away from being an associate in corporate law.
Yes.
Can you tell me a bit about this decision?
Like a lot of people in law school, there's this hiring process. And so, the law firms come out there and, they make this big pitch, right? And so I think many of us think that that's like the default path. So I did a couple internships and I just didn't really like it that much. And so, I came back to Houston and decided like, hey, there's an opportunity to win this city council seat, and politics is something I'm really passionate about, and I think I'd have a shot at it, and could do a decent job. And so the law firm was super supportive and kind of let me defer my job. And so I deferred it, and then we ran this campaign, and I think ultimately the decision was, hey, I can always go back to the law firm, but there's not necessarily going to be this exact same opportunity to run, and so decided to defer and jump in.
Yeah. Um, I guess following up with that, do you
Hmm.
see yourself ever returning to corporate law? You said you didn't really like the
No.
whole internship. No. Okay. Straight up no. Okay, great. Um, Also, okay, so this might be a bit more personal, but
Yep.
how were you able to kind of persuade your parents, or did you even
Okay. Of
have to persuade your parents
course.
to let you pursue politics and nonprofit work?
Yeah, it's an ongoing process. I think that their perspective, coming from India, with where politics is often viewed as kind of a corrupt enterprise,
Mm.
and nonprofit is not seen with the respect that I think it should be,
Mhm.
quite frankly. And so yeah, it's absolutely been a process. I think what has helped is like, one, um, w- uh, we try to have like a detailed plan of how I think this can work. I think the second is, spend a lot of time talking about, hey, like, I'm lucky that I could go back to a law firm if I had to, and so there's that. And then I think the third is, I think um, passion and energy and drive, those are kind of contagious. And so when someone sees just someone in general who is really passionate about something, they kind of get excited. And I think it's just multiplied significantly when it's someone you know and care deeply about. And so I think they've seen that I'm really passionate about this. Um, and so that's helped. But I would not say that it's a done deal. And I think that Asian Americans certainly face different pressures than do other communities, but I think also have different supports that other communities don't have. And so I think it's every community sort of has their I guess idiosyncrasies or perceptions, and I think every generation it sort of gets a little less, I guess, gets a little less like regimented, and I think becomes more sort of flexible.
Mhm. Okay, so kind of moving on to your nonprofit work, I
Yep.
really appreciate your background. Can you tell me a bit about Momentum Education and your journey with the organization? Please feel free to name your accomplishments of the organization since its inception and any future goals.
Yeah. So when I was a teacher back in 2013 to 2015, some friends and I started a couple of organizations, um, to sort of a couple of nonprofits to kind of help students get to and through college. And so neither of those had been super successful, in part because we did not necessarily have somebody who's was sort of devoting their life like a true startup needs. And so, in January after the election, sort of decided to combine all the previous efforts into one. Um, and so we launched Momentum Education, kind of to help students get to and through, uh, post-secondary education. And so, we basically help students from the day they join, ninth grade through the day they graduate from college or vocational school or community college and get into the workforce. Um, and so we help with things like mentorship, with things like connecting them to summer programs, with things like helping them get support on their college essays and resumes, to things like helping introduce them to different colleges over Zoom because they don't have the wherewithal and the means to necessarily go visit, to introducing to different careers that perhaps they're not super familiar with, to connecting them to summer internships. Right now we have about 550 students who have sort of been supported by us or in the program. That's only growing. And so, yeah, we're really excited to, start in Houston and do a really good job and then, slowly branch out. But I think for us, the gold star, the North Star is, 100% of our kids must graduate high school. 100% must matriculate to some post-secondary education, whether it's 4-year, 2-year community college. 100% need to graduate, and then 100% got to enter the workforce. And so until we're doing that at a high level, I think we still have a lot of work to do.
Can you tell me a bit about any initiatives maybe that Momentum Education has taken during COVID-19 and like the pandemic?
Yeah, sure. So, number one is we started a team that is reviewing college application essays online. This is essential right now during COVID because many schools are becoming test optional. And so therefore, the college essay takes on greater significance, quite frankly. The second thing is we dramatically ramped up scholarship giving. So we gave away about $25,000 this year to scholarships because we know students and families are in a really, really tough situation. The third is, we did not plan to have so many career conversation events and college information sessions. And now we have like at least 1 or 2 per week. And so I think we've just sort of gone all in on the Zoom idea about still trying to bring students the same level of programming that we would have brought them otherwise. And so, I think I wouldn't say we're perfect, but I would say that, we're just every day trying to get a little better.
Yeah. So I also saw that you co-founded One Jump and Swag to College. Can you speak a bit about these organizations?
Yeah, so those are the two that came together to make Momentum.
Okay.
And so, yeah, we started One Jump 2013 with some friends, and then Swag to College 2015. One of them helping students with summer opportunities, the other one with mentorship. And, they were stronger together now where kind of everything's under one roof and we have, I'm all in and this is kind of true kind of startup founder level commitment. And so, I think we just realized that independently they were not going to sustain themselves, but together, I think we have a shot.
I see. Um, at what point did you find like the calling to dedicate yourself to serve the community? And did you have any role models during this process?
Yeah. I when I became a teacher, um, I think I sort of saw, let me back up. When I was in 8th grade, um, I used to still sometimes do stutter a lot. And so when I was in 8th grade, I had a teacher named Beth Sanford who was a theater teacher, whatever, like theater teacher, art director, whatever. And so she really helped me. She pushed me to try out for this play, The Little Prince, which I did not want to do, and end up getting in and was the Aviator, which is like a role with a lot of lines, basically. And it was very tough, obviously, someone who stuttered, but she really helped me through it. And now, way, way, way better than what I was before, in a large part because of her coaching and her support. And so I think that was the first moment I was like, wow, okay, like a teacher can have a huge impact on someone's life, can like dramatically change someone's life. And then when I actually did become a teacher, I think I saw that I had students who, shared the same aspirations as I did, whose parents were just as hardworking, whose community wanted the same thing, but who just didn't have the same opportunities I had. Um, and I think when you see that vast inequity, I think that was when I said, okay, this is what I want to do, particularly around education. And then I think when you start doing this, you start finding people who you look up to. So, I mentioned Julian and Joaquin Castro, so both of whom, could have gone to a big law firm. And, when I say role model, of course, Barack Obama, of course, big folks like that who, you don't get a chance to necessarily know super well, but, Julian and Joaquin, particularly Joaquin Castro is now a congressman. Like I got to know him pretty well. And so he's someone who I really look up to, who sort of devoted his life to this. I think Ruth Turley, someone who I look up to a lot, who, has figured out a way to really, really focus her career on trying to make an impact. And then I think about someone like Chris Barbick, who started Yes Prep, which is a charter school in Houston where I taught. And so Chris has become a real role model and mentor for me on kind of how to start an organization and how to really devote your life to something. I'm reading a book right now about Jeffrey Canada, who started the Harlem Children's Zone in New York, someone who also, I think very highly of. And so, yeah, there's a bunch of people who I look up to who've sort of taken this path of, public service.
I think now I'm going to shift into more like city council.
Sure.
I see that you ran for city council, which is very impressive. Can you tell me a bit about your platform and why you wanted to run?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it always came back to, we have these um, vast inequities. And as a teacher, I saw students who were often affected by issues outside the classroom. So flooding, whether there was public transit, whether there was access to healthy food. And so we were our whole vision was this idea of like one Houston where everyone has an opportunity to succeed, not depending on where you grew up or where you live. And so, we spent a lot of time talking about obviously flooding and of course, economic opportunity as well, because we sort of saw like what is of course possible. And then kind of these, quality of life issues around, public transit or environmental injustice. And I think for us, the big focus was, how do we try to advance some policies that will help make the city more fair and provide more opportunities for folks.
Um, During your campaign, did you find any areas where support like you felt you needed might have been lacking?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if I ran pretty clearly as a Democrat, even though it's a nonpartisan race. And so I think we didn't do as well, among conservatives as we could have. Um, so I think that's one. And then I think I didn't do a good enough job of, making sure that I visited every community and learned every issue and listened to every person. Like, I think we worked really hard, but sometimes we got kind of focused in certain areas. And so I think that was the second one. And then, I think the final thing was, we, I think we just didn't necessarily win over as many, um, folks in maybe Kingwood or Clear Lake, for example, as we could have. And so if you look at kind of how I did, particularly in the runoff against the incumbent, those two areas were ones where we could have done much better.
Do you see more chances for like public service or running for another public office in the future?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely am going to do that again. It's just a matter of when. I think, I, I think one of the things that people very fairly critiqued me for was, he's young, he hasn't really done anything yet, um, and so like, why is he ready for city council? And I think that's a fair, it's a fair critique. And so I think, want to spend some time really building this up. But yeah, I definitely think I'll run again.
Um, okay, so you were a part of the Life After Rice Young Alumni Political Engagement and Advocacy panel.
Oh yeah, like
Um,
last week or something.
yeah.
2 weeks ago. Yeah.
um, how was this experience and what led you to want to participate?
I think for me, it was great. First of all,
Mhm.
for me, it's always like, I think about two things. One is like people have an obligation to pay it forward, period, full stop. And so there were mentors who supported me and who guided me and took time to kind of help me, figure out where I wanted to get to and sort of connected me to folks. And so I think I have an obligation to do that for others. And the second is, Julian Castro, as I mentioned, someone I really look up to, has a quote. He says, "The American dream is not a sprint or a marathon, but a relay." And so, I genuinely believe that we all have an obligation to kind of do whatever we can, but then also to pass the baton to the next generation. And so anytime I get an opportunity to talk to people, particularly those who might be younger, like maybe students or whatever, I mean, I take that because I think I genuinely believe that we have an obligation to sort of like pass the baton.
Yeah. Um, so similarly, it's very like encouraging to see younger Asian Americans pursue public service in the US because we seem to be kind of like an underrepresented group in this
hmm
sector.
hmm
Um, and so like how important is it for like Asians to follow suit?
I think that we just have to do a better job of saying, look, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. Like that's great, and we should 100% support folks in doing that. But we should also 100% support folks in doing anything else. And so I think you know um, nurturing people's passions and supporting them as they try to reach those. I mean that's what it's all about. And so I met someone who recently who said to me, she said, so her daughter, South Asian, older woman, mid 60s probably, who really helped on my campaign. And we were chatting recently, and I just asked her, like, what inspired you to like volunteer a lot and stuff? And she said, Raj, um, my daughter's a baker. She left her job to become a baker and like run a bakery. And a lot of people in the community did not support that because they're like, what's like a baker? Come on, it's not a big thing. But she said, like, I supported her because like she's passionate about it. And she said the reason I volunteered in her campaign is like we got to have more people who are pursuing their passion. And like I can't just talk the talk. Like I got to walk the walk, basically. And that was her point. And I thought that was like incredible. And so I think for me, it's like, you know, um, if there are people, particularly Asian American, really anyone who's focused on their passion, like I'm going to do whatever I can to help nurture it because, and in particular, if it's something that, the community maybe doesn't support as much as it could.
Yeah. So how can the community do better to kind of inspire and support the younger generation to commit to not only public service, but as you mentioned, like passions?
Like I think one is like sort of finding opportunities for young folks to meet people who are older who have done that. I think the second thing is um, sort of thinking about how can we create systems to help people. So like, for example, if somebody wants to run for political office, let's have a support for like Asian Americans who want to run, or Asian Americans who want to be have a startup, or an Asian American who wants to do XYZ. um, and then I think the third one is just kind of starting the dialogue. I think now this is sort of becoming more mainstream to have a conversations like this. So, whatever people think of like Andrew Yang, it was a big deal that he ran for president. It was a big deal that the guy, stayed at the law firm for 6 months and then left and then like worked in like a nightclub or something in part of like what he did, right, or whatever. And so I think that, and I think it's important to see Kamala Harris, perhaps become, the first South Asian, the first African American woman, to be vice president. I think those would be big, big signs. And I think it's not just in politics. I mean, you can take nonprofits. So, be helpful to see folks leading nonprofits too. And so, or whatever project, it might be. And so, I think that's kind of how I think about it.
Okay, so transitioning into kind of like the pandemic, what are your views about and takeaway from how the Houston community was going through like during the pandemic, and how like the government kind of handled it?
Well, I mean, I think on the local level, I think Houston community, I think we did well. And I think that, the mayor and, the county judge, Lina Hidalgo, I think they were particularly like Lina was pretty forwardly looking in putting some restraints in place. Now, of course, some of that was preempted by the state, which I think, made some mistakes, like opening bars a little bit early, which probably led to the uptick. Obviously, at the federal level, the response has been, woefully inadequate, particularly from the White House, denying this thing and then, saying it's not helpful to wear a mask and you should like ingest Lysol or wash yourself. Like whatever he said about that was just ridiculous. And so I think that's there. But I do think that like now, when I go to, for example, I go to my office on weekends when there aren't too many folks there, and I see, and so I'll go to Chipotle to pick up a burrito. Everyone's wearing a mask, or I look at the fact that many religious organizations have come together to step up in this moment. Or I look at the fact that teachers are really figuring out how to be heroes in this by teaching remotely, and students and parents. And I think we've pulled together as a community. But I think what it illustrates is the community can do a lot, but if you don't have the right support from the federal government, like state government, like it just becomes very hard to sustain this. So, the fact that people don't have a second stimulus, it's just ridiculous. Or the fact that the state could not, provide more supports for folks, like a moratorium on evictions, make it longer. Granted, the CDC now did something, but I think the point is that, yeah, communities are strong for sure. Religious organizations, nonprofits, companies giving so much, a lot of companies locally doing a great job, but without an adequate systemic policy response, it's not sustainable forever. And I think we're seeing that, which is why, over 200,000 deaths. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
So what do you see for kind of like the future of Houston, like post-COVID?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be very interesting because we're a city that's just so much sprawl. But, it'd be interesting to see, can people work from home? Can that continue? And if so, how does that change where people want to live? I think that's a very interesting question. I think a second question is, how do we think about diversifying the economy? We saw, obviously the city was hit by the pandemic, but then also oil prices went down. So we can't, be a city maybe just reliant or just be the oil capital of the world. We want to be that whole energy capital, means wind, means solar. I think the third is, it'll be very interesting to see, Houston has significant disparities between income, often correlated with race. It'll be interesting to see how those are exacerbated. Obviously, educational disparities are real. That's going to only get worse. And so I think there's going to be real need for policies after the pandemic.
I have one final question.
Of course.
So you have already accomplished so much, from law school to nonprofit organizations to running for city council. Do you have a vision of how you want to lead for like the rest of your life, and what you want to apply, like where you want to apply like your talent next? Okay, the rest of your life is kind of a long way, but I guess just future.
Yeah. I mean, what I think about every day is, how do we build a city, a state, a country, a world where there's just more opportunities for all folks, and where people are not left behind because of their socioeconomic status or their race or where they're born or their religion or their gender or sexual orientation, or whatever. And so for me, it's every single day, I want to be doing something that is helping folks get better opportunities. And I think for the time being, I think that's going to be with momentum, because I think we have an opportunity to really move the ball down the field for kids and families. And then I think the second thing that'll always be there is, how can I continue to pay it forward and pass the baton to the next generation of folks who are coming up, who are so passionate about, wanting to kind of do their part.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank you for your time in
No, thanks, Chelsea.
doing this interview. I will send you a follow-up email with like more details about our archive and next steps. Do you
Okay.
have any questions for me?
I think I'm good, Chelsea.
Okay. All right.
Cool.
Well, take care.
All right. I'll see you later. Keep me
Right.
posted, whatever I can do to help. Bye-bye.
Yes. All right. Bye.